Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we're doing a little bit of an oddball review compared to several of the recent reviews and also several of the upcoming reviews on the channel. Today we are talking about Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule, first book of the High Republic series within Star Wars. To address the elephant in the room right at the beginning of this video, I am not diametrically opposed to Disney canon as others tend to be, at least these days. I will not say everything in it is either good or bad for no real reason. There's no real active dogpile for me as far as Disney canon goes, one way or the other. To tell you the truth, I am much more interested in Legends material of Star Wars, as basically everything back here kind of shows you on that shelf. Because most of the stories in there are more interesting to me, or at least garner my interest a little bit more, we'll say. There's also several I know to some degree just kind of by osmosis, and therefore want to experience those stories for myself in full. So there's just too much in Legends for me to really feel like I care actively for Disney canon. But obviously, the High Republic is Disney canon. So why did I choose to go through Light of the Jedi before basically any of Legends as far as, my experience up to this point is concerned? Well, the simple answer to that question is that I had a little buddy read along kind of go in with just a few friends last summer for book one, which is Light of the Jedi, of course, what we're covering today. It was also, ironically, right around the time that The Acolyte was airing. It was not due to that, because The Acolyte kind of takes place in the High Republic as far as I'm understanding. And the book also came as a legit recommendation from a friend of mine, Doombot, who is an absolute dork in all of the best ways possible. And by dork, I should actually probably say geek. He knows a lot about a lot of different things and is very deep in, not the fandoms, but like very deeply knowledgeable about a ton of different, we'll say, nerdy things. And Star Wars is one of those things. Both original canon and Disney canon he knows quite a bit about. Like I said, this book came as a pretty high recommendation from him, and despite my reservations, he assured me of the quality of the book. So how was my experience with Light of the Jedi at the end of the day? Well, that's a good question. Let's discuss that now. We'll begin just as I always do with the good of the book, and that is that the setting is interesting and believable for the Star Wars universe. Taking place hundreds of years before the prequels, the High Republic isn't exactly the Old Republic, but it is before the timeline of the, most popular era of Star Wars, the movie eras of Star Wars. As such, I felt like it was a little bit easier to swallow as being Disney canon instead of proper, well, I guess the original canon will say not proper canon. I don't want to, incite anything here. But as far as that goes, it was easier for me to swallow this being a different type of story, different canon of story technically, because it takes place before everything rather than after everything. I don't know why that is, but that is how I felt nonetheless. Canonically, as well, High Republic depicts Jedi at their peak, like their actual peak of peacekeeping, not necessarily the height of their active power, although that's kind of implied, but the height of them as an organization. And I confess I was pretty intrigued by that idea. Despite Light of the Jedi being Disney canon, it also doesn't squander the idea of Star Wars to me. It definitely retains the spirit and the vibe of the IP that I personally enjoy, that I personally remember from other stuff that I've experienced from older canon or whatever else. Yet it also sets itself apart from some of the inherent cliches that kind of exist because of Star Wars. It satisfies the basic needs of a lifelong but long-time separated fan. The book's unique exploration of the Jedi and the Force in context of the universe is pretty enjoyable as such. It's a little bit of a different take, but I think it's pretty good. Obviously, plenty of this sort of exploration comes from the premise of, the Jedi being at their peak of power, I guess we'll say, which was, in fact, a pretty awesome concept. The cast of characters specifically within the book also felt pretty diverse. It also felt like it wasn't beholden necessarily to maybe some of the baggage of the canon that came before, but doesn't, again, grossly stray away from it so as to be offensive. Beyond some of that material, the way that Soule specifically dives into some niche topics within the Star Wars universe is also pretty great. I would say hyperspace technicalities and travel and stuff like that was incredible, and I loved all of that. There are also various other aspects I think are worth noting about this book, in that the characters I could keep up with were very good characters. The various storylines evolving throughout the story were done so in dynamic ways that were easy to digest and fun to follow. The Chancellor and, the Coruscant material I thought was great. In particular, that stuff felt very Star Wars to me. But the antagonists are also pretty special idea within Light of the Jedi. Speaking of the Nihil as the antagonists, again, they're splendid, absolutely splendid bad guy stuff. You don't get a ton of the Nihil throughout in this book, but what you do get is evolved and expanded upon brilliantly in all of the right ways at all of the right times. The end of the book especially definitely flipped the vibe as I was reading this into I need more of this material pretty effectively. I had enjoyed the book up to that point, but I wasn't entirely convinced yet that I would continue until the last few hours. But on the opposite end of the story from the ending, part 1 of Light of the Jedi is just perfect. If there's one thing about this book that I would say, read this so that you can experience it, it is part 1. The entire, maybe not quite the first third of it, but it's a pretty solid chunk of the book. Just absolutely incredible. The balls on Soule to do what this part 1 does to start a series, just absolutely humongous. Seriously, I was so invested in the beginning of the book that I got through part 1 in just one sitting. Even with audio, I find it pretty difficult to get through that much material, and given that I had already read a few hours of Infinite Jest of all books prior to going through part 1 of Light of the Jedi, it was very engaging for me to get through all of that. If anybody could get through the first part of this book and not be hype, I don't know, I just don't really think that's entirely possible. But for the bad, because there are a couple things that did somewhat hold the book back for me, I confess I wasn't always down for the exploration of the Jedi and Force stuff. I mentioned this as being good in the sense that it's interesting and I like the general direction that things went, but I would say that some of the details of things, weren't always for me. I respected going in some new and different directions in regard to how the Jedi functioned hundreds of years before the prequels, for example, and the Force kind of being a little bit, not different per se, but being, different's the right word, but it's also the wrong word, just being a little bit different from what maybe you're used to, or doing some things in unexpected ways. I respected that the book does that, even if the nitty-gritty details of that all doesn't always click for me. Again, it's a case of never being offensive, but occasionally something every once in a while kind of stuck out as being a little bit weird. But the only really notable flaw of the book, in my opinion, is that the cast is maybe a bit too big for the scope of it at this point. In fairness, this is book 1 of a series of 5 books, so I see the cast and the general size and scope of it fitting overall, the series entire, but it was also a little bit hard to keep track at times for me, although, I could easily blame that on the audiobook, not because the audio is bad, but rather because I struggle to retain information like proper nouns, for example, names and locations, this kind of thing. I really struggle with that kind of stuff in an audio format as opposed to, visually reading it. I have a somewhat a photographic memory as far as things like this go. I can remember names by the way they look. It's kind of a weird way to describe things, but because I'm never able to see the way things look and are spelled out, I sometimes struggle to place what is what in accordance to my memory when I'm doing things solely off of audio as opposed to a physical book or even Kindle, but eyeball reading versus listening. So, there's a little bit of that aspect. I struggled to follow with some of the characters sometimes in Light of the Jedi, but I do think that's just as much a me problem having experienced the audio as much as it is an actual problem with the cast being too big. So it's, kind of a a flaw with an asterisk beside it, I guess. For the ugly, well, let's just say that Star Wars inherently comes with a lot of baggage, especially over the last 10 years of the IP. I don't need to go into the details of any of that, to be perfectly honest, but if you are super opposed just inherently to new canon stuff, you're obviously probably going to pick apart a lot of things in this and not really like it that much. But it may just find a few ways to surprise you in spite of that, and I'm actually pretty serious about that, by the way. This actually felt like Star Wars to me, despite it being new canon, and that's why I'm not inherently or diametrically opposed to Disney canon stuff. Because, you know, some of it can be good, even if maybe it doesn't fit like my personal headcanon of what is actually canon. You know, not to be redundant or anything, but that is the case. For the recommendation of Light of the Jedi, I think this is worth checking out for part 1 alone. I kind of said that already earlier in the video, but part 1 is just incredible. The Great Disaster is actually a perfect sequence, like one of the rare genuinely perfect sequences in a book, in my opinion. It is just that good. It is so good, in fact, that I kind of want to reread just part 1 of this book before continuing on in the series to kind of remind myself of some of the characters, you know, just to the degree that they are involved in that first part, because the first part basically introduces all the major players for the rest of the book, actually. Not fully, but nearly. And it's great. Besides part 1 as well, I think that the villain has compelled me to read on in the series, so soonish I will probably end up doing that. A lot of time has passed since I read this book. Unfortunately, at the time of this recording, it's been about 8 months since I read Light of the Jedi. At the time of the release of this video, it's been about 10 months. So I'm almost embarrassed about how long it's been. Not quite the amount of time that it took me to continue Faithful in the Fallen, though. That took me like 13 or 14 months or something like that to actually continue. I intended to continue this series pretty immediately, relatively speaking, but I decided to do more McCarthy instead, and after finishing all of McCarthy's stuff, I was burnt out on audiobooks in general. But now I think I might be in the mood to get back into the series, like starting to return to it. Not just the series as well, like audio in general. I haven't really done any audio since I finished McCarthy. Since I'm feeling the mood to come back to this, I've been itching to return to The Wandering Inn as well. I would obviously like to finish this series. I think maybe, you know, fingers crossed, here's hoping whatever I choose next in audio will go well, and maybe I'll continue this series pretty soon. If you've read more than one book in the series, let me know how things continue. I'd love to know. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.